Good evening. I'm Teresa Skubik, and this is Forum Daily for Tuesday, March 4th. We begin tonight with North America now in a full-blown trade war. Yesterday, U.S. President Trump confirmed that tariffs were coming today, and that is expectedly what happened at 12:01 a.m. In response, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced a series of retaliatory tariffs this morning.
Canadians are reasonable, and we are polite, but we will not back down from a fight. Not when our country and the well-being of everyone in it is at stake. At the moment, the U.S. tariffs came into effect in the early hours of this morning, and so did the Canadian response. Canada will be implementing 25% tariffs against $155 billion worth of American goods, starting with tariffs on $30 billion worth of goods immediately, and tariffs on the remaining $125 billion of American products in 21 days' time. But in the meantime, our tariffs will remain in place until the U.S. tariffs are withdrawn, and not a moment sooner. And should these tariffs not cease, we are in active and ongoing discussions with provinces and territories to pursue several non-tariff measures, measures which will demonstrate that there are no winners in a trade war.
The Prime Minister also used his time at the podium to speak directly to Americans and warned that Americans' jobs are now at risk.
I want to speak first directly to the American people. We don't want this. We want to work with you as a friend and ally. And we don't want to see you hurt either. But your government has chosen to do this to you. As of this morning, markets are down, and inflation is set to rise dramatically all across your country. Your government has chosen to put American jobs at risk, at the thousands of workplaces that succeed because of materials from Canada or because of consumers in Canada, or both. They've chosen to raise costs for American consumers on everyday essential items like groceries and gas, on major purchases like cars and homes, and everything in between. They've chosen to harm American national security, impeding access to the abundant critical minerals, energy, building materials, and fertilizers that we have and that the United States needs to grow and prosper. They've chosen to launch a trade war that will, first and foremost, harm American families. They've chosen to sabotage their own agenda that was supposed to usher in a new golden age for the United States.
And after the Prime Minister's address to Americans, he directly addressed the president.
Now, it's not in my habit to agree with the Wall Street Journal, but Donald, they point out that even though you're a very smart guy, this is a very dumb thing to do.
Mr. Trudeau stated there is absolutely no justification or need whatsoever for these tariffs, and fact-checked Donald Trump's claims that Canada is unwilling to help in the fight against fentanyl.
There is absolutely no justification or need whatsoever for these tariffs today. Now, the legal pretext your government is using to bring in these tariffs is that Canada is apparently unwilling to help in the fight against illegal fentanyl. Well, that is totally false. Let's look at the facts. Our border is already safe and secure. Far less than 1% of fentanyl flows and less than 1% of illegal crossings into the United States comes from Canada. But we acted because we know we can always do better. We responded to concerns, including from the President, by implementing an ambitious $1.3 billion border plan A border plan that includes generational investments in new AI and imaging tools to stop the flow of fentanyl in its tracks, stronger coordination and information sharing with American agencies, along with the deployment of drones, helicopters, and additional personnel to keep our border secure. Now, a month ago, as part of an agreement with the United States that paused the tariffs, we made further commitments. We appointed Kevin Brasseau as our fentanyl czar, a man who dedicated his multi-decade career in law enforcement to combating organized crime networks and drug trafficking. We designated 7 drug cartels, sick, evil groups who cynically profit off the pain and suffering of people on both sides of the border, as the terrorist organizations that they are. And just yesterday, we launched a new joint operations partnership supported by a $200 million investment between Canada's security and law enforcement agencies, a partnership that will enhance the coordination of information and intelligence in order to thwart criminal gangs involved in the illegal fentanyl trade. And critically, our actions are working.
To close out his press conference, Mr. Trudeau claimed that, quote, Canadians are insulted and angry, but we are Canadian, so we're going to stand up for each other, we're going to fight, and we are going to win.
But Canadians are hurt. Canadians are angry. We're going to choose to not go on vacation in Florida or Old Orchard Beach or wherever. We're going to choose to try to buy Canadian products and forego bourbon and other classic American products. And yeah, we're probably going to keep booing the American anthem. But let me tell Americans, we're not booing you. We're not booing your teams. We're not booing your players. We're booing a policy that is designed to hurt us. And we're insulted, and we're angry, but we're Canadian, which means we're going to stand up for each other, we're going to fight, and we're going to win.
And after the Prime Minister's press conference, Pierre Poilievre highlighted how he would enact counter tariffs, stressed that revenue generated from tariffs should be used for tax cuts, and called on Ottawa to reduce red tape to reduce the pain felt from Mr. Trump's tariffs.
But I'm here with a message of hope. We will overcome this attack on our economy, and I have a plan to do it. First, we must retaliate, targeting American goods in the following order. A, goods that we can make ourselves. B, goods we don't need. And C, goods we can get from elsewhere. Second, counter tariffs must not be a cash cow for the government. Almost every penny of the tariffs collected should go to tax cuts, with a small sum set aside for targeted relief to workers hardest hit by the trade war. None of the money should go to new government spending and programs. We must not allow politicians to dishonestly use this crisis to once again launch a debt-fueled, money-printing spending spree that will drive up inflation and further destroy the working class and hit the poorest people the hardest. Third, we must immediately pass a bring-it-home tax cut on work, investment, energy, and home building. The idea is to neutralize the cost of the tariffs with lower taxes and incentivize massive new investment in building stuff here in this country. The obvious place to start is to get rid of the Liberal carbon tax, then axe the sales tax on new homes. We need to reverse the Liberal capital gains tax hike and slash income tax so that hard work pays off and you bring home more of each dollar you earn. Fourth, we must immediately repeal the Liberal No New Pipelines Law, C-69, a law that not only blocks all pipelines but stops mines, refineries, export plants, and all kinds of other energy infrastructure and makes us hopelessly reliant on one customer, the Americans, a customer we cannot count on anymore. We must greenlight LNG plants that Liberals say there is no business case for so that we can no longer have to sell our 100% of our LNG, our gas exports to the Americans. We can sell it to Asia and Europe and help break the European dependence on Putin, turning dollars for dictators into paychecks for our people. 5, you know what industry Donald Trump does not control in Canada? Home building. It is a homegrown industry. We must get rid of all taxes and red tape to unleash the biggest home building boom this country has ever seen, bigger than the post-war boom when our heroes were coming back from that war. We need to build homes faster than ever, and that means removing the bureaucracy, the red tape, the taxes, and the gatekeepers, and I will make it happen.
All right, stay tuned. Up next, Doug Ford threatens to cut off power to the U.S. in response to U.S. tariffs. And China fights back alongside Canada by imposing its own retaliatory tariffs against the United States. Stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back after these messages. Following Prime Minister Trudeau's announcement of retaliatory tariffs, Ontario Premier Doug Ford repeated multiple times during his press conference that he will spare no expense to protect the people of Ontario and the people of Canada, just like during the pandemic. Mr. Ford also says that Americans only have Donald Trump to blame for Team Canada's opening response.
The battle is against President Trump. And I always emphasize, folks, I talk to endless Americans. I talk to endless elected officials. It is not them. Don't blame the American people. It's Donald Trump to be blamed for this.
Mr. Ford has threatened surcharges and outright restrictions on critical minerals and electricity that the U.S. depends on.
Today, I'm writing to every senator, every congressman and woman, and the governors from New York State, Michigan, and Minnesota, telling them that these tariffs persist. If the Trump administration follows through on any more tariffs, we will immediately apply a 25% surcharge on the electricity we export. We will not hesitate to shut off their power as well. I'm encouraging my fellow premiers to follow suit. Well, this is going to be a long battle, and we have to keep our ammunition dry for the next round. As the Commerce Secretary came out and President Trump has said, another round is going to hit us on April the 2nd. And I'm highly recommending to President Trump, don't force our hand. You underestimate Canadians, you're making a massive mistake. We're resilient, we're proud, and we're strong. And we will survive, and we will continue to thrive. We'll get through this together.
He also stated that part of Ontario's retaliatory measures will include ripping up its deal with Starlink, and that he's banning American companies from contracts with the province in any sector in the future.
I've asked the Ontario Public Service, the deputy ministers and our ministers to go through with a fine-tooth comb and anything, no matter if it's services through the tech sector or any other products, we need to stop immediately. And if they come at us, sue us, so be it. We're standing up for Ontario, we're standing up for Canada, and we're willing to fight in court. This is about principle, making sure that we send a message to Donald Trump, and unfortunately, the American people are going to pay for his actions because they elected him in, and they're going to pay the price. And I want to inflict as much pain as we possibly can until we get to a deal of the USMCA.
And New Brunswick's Premier Susan Holt announced her government's action plan in response to the tariffs. Ms. Holt told a press conference in Fredericton that the challenge of governing is finding the right balance that is in the best interest of New Brunswickers.
So we have been wrestling with how we support our entrepreneurs, how we ensure that we have a vibrant and active economy that presents the kind of good paying jobs that New Brunswickers can have to pay the bills and have a good quality of life. We know that New Brunswickers need better access to their healthcare systems. They need a strong education system for their kids and their future. They need affordable places to call home, and they want to see an environment that is well protected. And so we have to balance how we stimulate our economy in the face of a challenge that we have never seen before. Right now is not the time for austerity. Now is the time to get behind New Brunswick businesses and entrepreneurs, get behind New Brunswick workers, and show them that we have got their back. We are going to protect that economic activity in New Brunswick that will help us in the long term continue to make the investments that we're making in the healthcare system, in getting more New Brunswickers access to the care they need. So there's a real balance here. We've been engaging with economists, we've been engaging with stakeholders to try to find what is the best way forward that is fiscally responsible, but that addresses New Brunswickers' needs today and sets us up to deliver to those needs tomorrow.
When asked about where this support package would land in regard to the budget, Ms. Holt says that New Brunswick needs to make sure that entrepreneurs, communities, and workers in the province come out of this tariff fight, quote, stronger and resilient on the other side.
We've got to make sure there's an economy here to support the delivery of healthcare services and education services. So we are continuing to work very hard on the budget. We are trying to manage it while not kicking the can down the road. We have seen too many governments kick the can down the road and not enact the kind of transformational change that we need. We can't continue with the status quo. The status quo in our healthcare system is not going to work. The status quo in our education system is not going to work. The status quo in our economy is not going to work. We have to do things differently, and we have to change those tires while we're driving the bus. So it is a challenge, no question. We are approaching it with a focus on balance and making sure that New Brunswickers can have what they need, have the jobs they need to pay the bills, have the roof over their head that is affordable and safe, and have access to the health care that they and their loved ones need, all doing so in a way that we can manage in a fiscally responsible way over the long term.
And the Canadian Home Builders Association and their CEO spoke to the press in Ottawa, highlighting how the trade war will impact the sector.
Firstly, as an industry, we are very concerned about the U.S. tariffs and certainly condemn the direction President Trump is taking, which will affect Canada, but will also drive up construction costs even more in the United States. While the U.S. tariffs of 25% on Canada will be problematic, they in and of themselves will have muted effect on construction costs here in Canada. What will affect our market more will be our own counter tariffs and, most importantly, the impact the U.S. tariffs will have on our overall economy, which in turn will affect housing starts. A slowing economy invariably means slower housing starts, which, as we've explained, will have expansive repercussions on housing supply, our industry, and long-term affordability.
And China is fighting back alongside Canada, imposing tariffs of up to 15% on imports of key U.S. farm products. The Chinese Commerce Ministry says the tariffs will take effect on March 10th, though goods already in transit will be exempt until April 12th. Imports of U.S.-grown chicken, wheat, corn, and cotton will face an extra 15% tariff. Mr. Trump also says that he is adding agricultural products from Canada to his growing list of tariff targets. Posting on social media, Mr. Trump says that the great farmers of the United States should prepare to, quote, start making a lot of agricultural products to be sold inside of the United States. He says the additional tariffs will go on external products starting on April 2nd. This is a policy that has been tried before, and the Consumer Choice Center's Bill Wirtz joined us for more.
Well, Teresa, just like with a lot of things that Donald Trump says and does, it sounds good if you don't think about it. And import tariffs are one of those things that are really just a bad idea, because while it's true that the United States currently imports more food products than it exports, we have to look at some of the reasons that have caused this. And an expensive dollar, a dollar that does well internationally, is one of those reasons that, you know, for a lot of retailers, it's cheaper, and food processors is cheaper to import. But we also have to consider that American farmers do export a significant amount also. So, for instance, if you're for those in the fields of food grains and oilseeds, more than half of what is produced in the United States goes abroad. So if Donald Trump says we're going to tariff Canada and the European Union because those are the ones that send us the most products, well, they're also some of the ones that buy the most from America. So it is, and there will be retaliatory tariffs. So it's one of those policies that, again, it sounds good in theory, but it doesn't really work in practice. The farm system is complicated. There's farmers that specifically gear their products for exports. There's those who don't. What I find very what I find very telling about this is that farmers that have traditionally been very loyal to the Republican Party have not really been consulted. This is an idea that Donald Trump just came up with, and then he tweets it out and posts it out there, and he hasn't looked at the ramifications that this will have on American farmers. If you want to do these kind of policies, you're going to have to do some impact assessments and talk to experts and actually think about it before you implement it. This has been, import tariffs have been tried all over the place, and as Europeans, we know that a lot of the tariff barriers that we have imposed also don't really work. It makes food more expensive for everyone. But I think the most telling example is Argentina, which is currently trying to unwind its tariff policy. So Argentina does not only just charge a 22% import tariff, it even charges almost a 30% export tariffs for its farmers. So it really tries to rely on itself completely. And if anyone has just sort of been looking at food price inflation in Argentina, which at least before the election of President Milei was at about 187%, everything has just become incredibly expensive because there's not this diversification in the local production that you would imagine. You think sometimes, well, why don't we just make everything ourselves if we're a big country? But that's not really how the food supply chain works. Some of the things you can't really make at home. Some of the things you might have a bad harvest, and it's good to rely on imports. It's good to rely on imports for inputs for your farmers. So Argentina really has tried this. And now the current government is really trying to unwind it. So I think following the example of South American countries or other countries that had bad examples with agricultural tariffs is just a bad idea. On top of which is that, you're just upsetting all of your neighbors that you are supposed to be good friends with. Trade is part of your soft power as a country. So I think putting these tariffs up it's bad policy, it's bad for consumers, it's bad for farmers, it's bad for everyone.
Coming up, we'll be speaking to National Post columnist Adam Zivo regarding Donald Trump's recent decision to pause military aid to Ukraine. After that, we'll have an update on Pope Francis's health. Don't go anywhere. Forum Daily will be right back after these messages. Ukrainians woke up this morning to find that Donald Trump has cut off their nation from military aid. As Ukrainians continue to fight against Russia's invasion, the rift between Kyiv and the White House continues to grow. Mr. Trump has directed U.S. assistance to Ukraine to be halted as he seeks to pressure Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to engage in peace talks with Russia. This morning, Ukraine's chair of foreign affairs told the BBC that the decision feels like Mr. Trump is siding with Russia.
To me and to my colleagues in the parliament and to all Ukrainian people, it came as a shock. Because on the surface, this decision looks as a disastrous decision, especially right now, when we are in desperate need of American weaponry, American support, to suspend military aid to Ukraine. It looks like siding with Russia. And it's extremely dangerous because as far as I know, this suspension also encompasses air defense systems, missiles for air defense systems. And it's dangerous. In Kyiv, in other cities, we're being bombarded and shelled by Russia each day. And we might see very soon the serious consequences, dangerous consequences on that. And I'm appealing to Mr. Trump not to play with these dangerous issues because we're talking about lives, human lives of Ukrainians. And if you stop giving us weaponry, we cannot defend ourselves effectively. We cannot save lives of people.
And at this morning's press conference on tariffs, Prime Minister Trudeau addressed Trump's decision to pull aid from Ukraine.
Canada and Canadians are very clear. We know who our friends are. We know who our opponents are. And there is no question that Vladimir Putin and his attack not just on Ukraine, but on the rules-based international order, on the founding principles of the United Nations, is an opponent of Canada. I think the question that we all need to be watching closely is, what do the American people think? How do Americans feel about jettisoning one's friends and allies in favor of a country that has never wished Americans well and continues to act in ways that harm the global economy and specifically the American economy and American values and principles?
We're now joined by columnist Adam Zivo, who recently returned from Ukraine. Adam, thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Now, what was your reaction this morning to the news that the U.S. has pulled military aid from Ukraine, and how much of an impact do you think this is going to have on Ukraine's ability to defend itself?
I'm aghast. Everyone who I know who is in Ukraine, whether they're Ukrainian, whether they're a volunteer, whether they're a journalist working at the grassroots level, they're all aghast too. We all knew that Donald Trump had sympathies towards Russia. We didn't expect the situation to deteriorate so completely and so quickly. And I think that obviously this is going to impact Ukraine's ability to defend itself. The main thing, though, is that Ukraine currently receives about 30% of its military material from the United States. It produces 40% and receives 30% from the Europeans. So as of now, from my understanding, they'll be okay for the next 2 or 3 months. But after that point, the situation might become quite dire. And though the Europeans have committed to stepping up and providing additional aid to fill the gap left by the United States, they lack the industrial base to fully substitute for U.S. weapons.
And you actually just returned from the Ukraine. Now, have you reached out to any of your contacts there to see how they're reacting to this news?
There's no need to reach out. I see it all over their social media. Everyone is horrified by it. And one of the things that really frustrates me is that Trump and his allies have portrayed this as an act of sympathy to everyday Ukrainians. They've attempted to portray Zelensky as some kind of dictator who is pushing everyday men and women into war against their consent. That's not the reality on the ground at all. And anyone who believes that narrative is someone who hasn't taken the foot inside Ukraine or hasn't listened to Ukrainians at all. Ukrainians are deeply afraid of Russia. They know what it's like to live under Russia because Ukraine was subjected to Russian domination for centuries. Right. And they know what it's like in the occupied territories. I have been in liberated areas. I've had friends who've been in the torture chambers. Right. And so when they hear that their country is essentially being disarmed so that they can be pushed into a bad peace with Russia, which will likely, accumulate in another invasion in a few years from now, no one's happy with that.
And in terms of military aid, what exactly does Ukraine need in order to be able to fend for themselves?
Well, I mean, they need, for example, additional air defense systems. So last year, when the Republicans blockaded aid for 6 months, air defense, they ran out, right? They didn't have enough rockets to intercept the missiles. And this had a direct impact in that attacks on Ukrainian cities further away from the front lines increased dramatically, and their ability to hit critical infrastructure increased dramatically. So my friends, my loved ones in Ukraine had to live without electricity last summer because the electrical grid was destroyed because air defenses were depleted because of these Republicans. So we'll probably see that again as well. We need tanks. We need additional drones. Although thankfully the Ukrainians produce their own drones, so maybe they can fill in that gap themselves. But on the whole, Ukraine needs every kind of weapon it can get its hands on.
Now, with the United States pulling out their military aid, the UK hosted over the weekend lots of world leaders in Europe to talk about what they can do and how they can boost their defense spending in order to support Ukraine. Is there a way that Europe can actually rally enough military aid to help Ukraine, or is this not looking good?
I mean, they can increase their military aid, but the thing is that they should have started increasing their production 3 years ago. We've been warning them again and again and again that if they don't step up earlier, then they're going to pay more later, which is happening, right? So they've committed to spending maybe around 5% of their GDP on defense, which is far higher than they currently spend. I mean, many of them were spending around 2%. But you can't just turn that money into weapons right away. You have to build your industrial capacity, and that takes time. And they could have spent the past 3 years doing that, but they didn't. So while I think that it will be helpful, I think that Ukraine is going to go through a very difficult period for the next year or two if the war does continue.
Now, I want to go to the encounter that Zelensky and Trump had in the Oval Office because it's left a lot of mixed reviews. A lot of people are quite disgusted with the way Trump reacted, and other people are actually agreeing with the things that he's saying about Vladimir Zelensky. So following that meeting, Zelensky said this morning that the Oval Office feud was regrettable. Do you think that should have been handled differently?
I don't think that Zelensky could have done anything to avoid what happened, because I think watching through that 45-minute conversation, it pretty clearly seemed like an ambush, right? It seemed like this was premeditated. And the chancellor of Germany, for example, from the new government that was just voted in, agrees with that, right? The first 35 minutes were amicable. Everyone spoke with mutual respect. There was obviously divergence in how they understood the war. Zelensky emphasized the suffering of his people. He emphasized the fact that 20,000 Ukrainian children had been kidnapped by Russian forces. He emphasized the fact that Ukrainian POWs are being beaten and tortured and starved. Whereas Trump tried to create a moral equivalency between the two sides. Zelensky correctly pointed out that Ukraine needs security guarantees, given that every single ceasefire Russia has signed in the past has been broken by Putin, right? This isn't the first time that someone has proposed diplomacy. This isn't the first time a ceasefire could be signed. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. Since then, there have been over a dozen ceasefires, and none of them have worked. So in that context, it makes sense for the Ukrainian president to say, well, you know, how can you ensure that we're actually protected? And then J.D. Vance blew up on the Ukrainian president in a really petulant and hectoring manner that I thought was, you know, really just disgusting to see. And his reaction was so disproportionate to what Zelensky said that it seems like what Zelensky said was irrelevant. It seemed like J.D. Vance just wanted to humiliate Ukraine.
Now, since that encounter, a lot of senior U.S. officials are saying that Zelensky should step down. What do you make of that claim?
It's ridiculous, right? So Zelensky has the broad support of his voters. So the most recent polling data puts his approval rating at around 60%, which, by the way, is far higher than that of Donald Trump's. The Ukrainian constitution prohibits elections from occurring during wartime because, I mean, it's destabilizing, right? So in World War I, both Canada and the UK didn't have elections. In World War II, the UK didn't have elections because guess what? If you bring people to a polling booth when your cities are being bombed, that creates a security problem. And that can be used strategically to disrupt an election to, you know, for example, advantage certain candidates. So this idea that Zelensky, a broadly popular president, should step down because he didn't act obsequiously enough to Trump, like that's absurd. And of course, it creates a further risk of election interference on Russia's end. It feels like essentially the United States wants to replace Zelensky with a puppet that will simply give up Ukraine and betray, you know, the Ukrainian nation.
Well, Adam, thank you so much for the time today.
Well, thanks for having me.
All right, don't go anywhere. Coming up after the break, we'll have more of today's top national and international headlines. Egypt published a plan for rebuilding Gaza by 2030 without removing its population. A driver in Mannheim, Germany, rammed a car into a crowd, killing 2 people and injuring at least 11. And former PEI Premier Dennis King is named Canada's ambassador to Ireland. These stories and more right after the break. A proposed European defense plan with an $841 billion price tag is being beefed up as the U.S. continues to act as a less reliable ally.
In the various meetings in the last few weeks, most recently 2 days ago in London, the answer from European capitals has been as resounding as it is clear. We are in an era of rearmament, and Europe is ready to massively boost its defense spending, both to respond to the short-term urgency to act and to support Ukraine, but also to address the long-term need to take on more responsibility for our own European security. And this is why I can announce that we will propose additional possibilities and incentives for member states, that they will decide if they want to use cohesion policy programs to increase defense spending. Now, the last 2 areas of action aim at mobilizing private capital by accelerating the Savings and Investment Union and, of course, through the European Investment Bank. So to conclude, Europe is ready to assume its responsibilities. Rearm Europe could mobilize close to 800 billion euros of defense expenditures for a safe and resilient Europe. We will, of course, continue working closely with our partners in NATO, This is a moment for Europe, and we are ready to step up.
European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says the massive Rearm Europe package will be put to the 27 EU leaders during a meeting in Brussels this week as emergency meetings gathered following a week of increased political uncertainty from Washington. Egypt has published a detailed plan for rebuilding the Gaza Strip by 2030 without removing its population. The multi-billion-dollar plan is a counter to Donald Trump's call to remove Gaza's roughly 2 million Palestinians permanently so that he can develop the territory as a tourist site for others. The first phase of the Egyptian plan calls for starting the removal of unexploded bombs and clearing the rubble left by Israel's bombardment and military offensives. In the following years, the plan envisions completely reshaping the territory and building housing and urban areas with renewable energy. Canada has a new ambassador to Ireland. The Prime Minister's office says that former Prince Edward Island Premier Dennis King is taking up the post. Mr. King resigned as Premier and Progressive Conservative leader last month, saying the decision was in the best interest of his family, the government, and PEI residents. He also resigned his seat as an MLA and said that he didn't want to seek elected office again. Canada's privacy watchdog is headed to court over the consent practices of adult website Pornhub. He found Pornhub and other pornographic sites broke the law by allowing intimate images to be shared without direct knowledge or consent. Pornhub's Montreal-based parent company has since made changes to some of its privacy practices and consent verification mechanisms. But the privacy commissioner argues the company's practices still fail to ensure meaningful consent is obtained from everyone in its videos. A 40-year-old man has been detained after a driver rammed a car into a crowd in southwestern German city of Mannheim. 2 people were killed and 11 others have been injured, 5 of them severely. The state interior minister says that as far as the specific motive of the crime is concerned, no existing indications suggest an extremist or religious background to the attack. The driver was reported to have shot himself in the mouth when he was arrested before going to hospital for medical treatment. The Vatican says that Pope Francis has stabilized enough after 2 respiratory crises to resume using a nasal tube for oxygen rather than a ventilation mask. The 88-year-old Pope had pneumonia and had part of 1 lung removed as a young man. The Vatican said he woke up Tuesday after sleeping through the night. The fact that Francis no longer needed the mask by Tuesday morning was a sign of some improvement after crises that required doctors to extract copious amounts of mucus from his lungs. But the doctor's prognosis remained guarded, meaning that he's not out of danger. Alanis Morissette is taking up residency in Las Vegas. The Ottawa-raised Hand in My Pocket singer has announced plans for a limited residency at the Coliseum at Caesars Palace. That's the venue that was famously built for fellow Canadian Celine Dion's 2004 residency that ran for nearly 5 years. Miss Morissette's 8 performances will be held on a scattering of dates from October 15th to November 2nd. Serena Williams, the 23-time major champion, who is considered by some the greatest tennis player of all time, is switching some of her focus to a different court. Williams will be joining the Toronto Tempo ownership, the WNBA team announced on Monday. She says she's looking forward to being part of the WNBA's first Canadian team. The WNBA expansion team says that Williams will play an active role in branding, including future jersey designs. Her investment is pending final league approval. And earlier this year, Boom Supersonic's XB-1 passenger jet achieved a successful test flight, becoming the first civilian-produced aircraft to break the sound barrier.
And she's airborne. Wow, that was fantastic. Doesn't she look gorgeous? Especially when the gear's up, she looks an absolutely beautiful airplane. And in the pilot's world, we say that if an aircraft looks right, she'll fly right. And XB-1 certainly looks right.
The aircraft reached an altitude of 34,000 feet before accelerating to the speed of sound. Boom Supersonic hopes to become the first supersonic passenger jet airline since the retired British-French Concorde. Sam Hammond from the Foundation of American Innovation joined us to unpack the significance of the test flight.
The history of air travel in the world is really going from the Wright brothers to fighter jets within a generation or two. And, air speeds also led in that trajectory. So Concorde was a government-led initiative with Britain and France. And so one of the initial problems was the Concorde was designed by committee. It was a government-backed venture, state-owned enterprise. They only ever produced 14 planes, so they never actually iterated. And while the Concorde flew for 27 years, its final flight was in 2003. Tickets were $20,000 a pop. The plane normally flew half full, so it was a technological success but a commercial failure. And there has yet to be, until boom, a real private sector civil supersonic aircraft to pick up where the Concorde left off.
We also discussed some of the regulatory hurdles that have impacted supersonic travel and what's recently changed.
The natural entry point for a private supersonic jet would have been business travel. And most business travel occurs over land. And supersonic jets produce a sonic boom. And so in 1973, the FAA in the United States banned civil supersonic over land in fear that it produced sonic booms and caused disturbances. This is effectively cut off the natural market entry point for a private sector initiative in the same way that Tesla first built the Roadster and only later came out with the Model 3. You need to start with that high-class clientele that will pay the premium to fly supersonic, but without overland being an option, the market couldn't provide. The boom is initially going to be targeting transoceanic flight routes, so San Francisco to Beijing to Tokyo, New York to London, and you can anticipate when their plane, the Overture, finally comes to market, that those routes will see their travel time cut in half, and boom is targeting a price comparable to business class today. Now, the overland issue is, so Boom didn't go into this industry planning to ever fly their plane over land. But in recent tests with their XB-1 demonstrator project, the first test flight, they discovered that actually there was no boom. And the reason there was no boom is because it turns out that under certain conditions and at certain altitudes, the boom will refract and never reach the ground. And so the loud clap that you would hear if a sonic boom flying over is a non-issue. And in addition to this, there are technologies around so-called low boom airplane designs where you can modify the shape of the wing, the shape of the body, and the nature of the engine to dampen the sonic boom effect and potentially get it down from something that sounds like a thunderclap to a car door slamming. So research and development into those kind of low boom technologies would require the FAA overturning the ban on supersonic overland so that the private sector actually knows that the technology has a market to begin with. But in lieu of that, we're going to have supersonic, at least for over the ocean, and maybe one day also for overland. Yeah, so Boom just did their first test flight of the XB-1, which was a demonstrator plane, so a one-seater, two-seater with a co-pilot. Their plans are to produce the Overture, their full-scale airliner that will seat probably 30 to 40 people within the next 2 to 4 years. They already have purchase orders from companies like United, and so there's a chance that this decade we will have supersonic.
I'm Teresa Skubik, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For more news on demand, you can always visit our website at forumdailynews.ca and make sure to follow us on our social media handles. You can also watch all of our commentary programming on the News Forum YouTube channel. Good night, Canada.